Something just happened in the background of American politics, and it's far more unsettling than any headline you've seen this week. Donald Trump, a man whose reputation was built on confidence, strength, and economic dominance, just stopped selling optimism. No victory laps, no promises of instant prosperity, no talk of booming markets. Instead, he raised a warning, not about his opponents, not about elections, but about the condition of the system itself. And when someone whose brand depends on projecting strength starts lowering expectations, that's not noise, that's a signal. Because this warning isn't aimed at Wall Street. It isn't aimed at Washington. It's aimed at reality. And if you hold dollars, own property, have a retirement account, or keep money in a bank, you should be paying attention right now. Welcome to the Wealth Continuum, where we don't react to headlines, we analyze incentives, history, and money flows. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because what we're about to connect isn't discussed honestly on mainstream channels. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. The US, Europe, Asia, because whatever direction this goes, it won't stay local. This affects everyone, and I want to know who's paying attention before the shift becomes obvious to everyone else. Here's what most people missed. Trump hasn't been celebrating the economy. He hasn't been promising an easy turnaround. He's been talking about what he's inheriting, about the mess beneath the surface, about structural problems that won't be fixed quickly, no matter who's in charge. That matters, because this is the same man who once measured success by stock market highs and GDP numbers. This time, he's not selling confidence, he's managing expectations. And historically, when leaders shift from selling upside to explaining limitations, it usually means risk is rising. That doesn't mean collapse is guaranteed, but it does mean the margin for error is shrinking, and shrinking fast. Think about that for a second. When was the last time you heard a leader prepare people for difficulty instead of promising easy solutions? It's rare. And it's rare because admitting fragility is politically dangerous. So when it happens anyway, when the narrative shifts from triumph to caution, it tells you something about what's visible behind closed doors, something the public isn't being told directly, but is being prepared for indirectly. And that preparation, that subtle shift in messaging, that's where the real information lives. On the surface, everything still looks fine. Markets fluctuate, but they're still standing. Banks are open, payments clear, the system functions. But stability and resilience are not the same thing. Since 2008, the US economy hasn't healed, it's been stabilized. Zero interest rates, quantitative easing, emergency liquidity programs. The Federal Reserve didn't fix the cracks, it bridged them. And bridges work until the weight increases. We've been adding weight for 15 years and nobody's talking about the load capacity anymore. They're just hoping the structure holds. But hope isn't a strategy, and the Federal Reserve knows it. Right now, they face a dilemma with no clean solution. Keep rates higher for longer and borrowing slows, housing cools, business stress rises. Cut rates too fast, and inflation risks returning. Dollar confidence weakens, purchasing power erodes. Neither path is comfortable. Both carry consequences. This is why messaging has shifted, not just from Trump, but across institutions. The system still functions, but it requires increasingly precise balancing. And systems that require perfection tend to fail when something unexpected happens. A geopolitical shock, a banking crisis, a sudden loss of confidence in treasury markets. Any one of these could be the thing that tips the balance. Now, let's talk about the number that quietly dictates everything. U.S. national debt, over $35 trillion. That number is difficult to emotionally process, so most people ignore it. But debt doesn't care whether you understand it. Interest costs rise regardless. Refinancing needs continue regardless. And as interest payments grow, they crowd out other priorities. We're now spending more on interest than on defense, more on servicing debt than on entire government programs that people depend on. Historically, this is where governments lose flexibility. They don't collapse immediately, they adjust. And adjustments are rarely painless. They come in the form of inflation, austerity, currency devaluation, or emergency measures that would have seemed unthinkable just years before. Some pressure points aren't flashy, but they matter. Commercial real estate is one of them. Office demand has structurally changed. Refinancing at higher rates is harder. Valuations have reset in many cities. Banks are managing this for now. But history shows that financial stress doesn't move in straight lines. The bank failures of 2023 weren't an accident. They were warnings. Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, First Republic. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a model that no longer works under new conditions. And when models break, they don't announce it with sirens. They break quietly behind balance sheets and quarterly reports until suddenly they don't. Here's something most people don't notice. Money moves long before stories change. Central banks are buying gold at record pace. Reserve diversification is accelerating. More trade is settling outside traditional dollar channels. This doesn't mean the dollar is about to vanish, but it does suggest preparation. And preparation tells you what institutions think might happen, not what they say publicly. When central banks, the people with access to the best information, the most sophisticated models, the deepest understanding of global flows, when they start hedging, you should be asking yourself why. Because they're not doing it for fun, they're doing it because they see risk that the public narrative isn't acknowledging yet. For decades, the dollar benefited from something rare: global dependence, oil priced in dollars, trade settled in dollars, debt denominated in dollars. That created constant demand that allowed the US to print trillions without immediate consequences, because the world needed those dollars to function. But dominance isn't permanent. It erodes at the edges, and erosion doesn't make headlines until it's advanced. Saudi Arabia is now open to pricing oil in other currencies. The BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems. China is stockpiling gold and reducing its treasury holdings. These aren't dramatic announcements, they're gradual shifts, but gradual shifts compound. And even a modest reduction in global dollar demand changes the math. Not overnight, but over time. And time has a way of accelerating when confidence starts to crack. History doesn't repeat, but it offers patterns. During past monetary stress, governments prioritized system stability. Individual purchasing power came second. Emergency tools became acceptable. In 1933, FDR confiscated gold from American citizens through executive order. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility to gold without asking permission. These weren't ideological decisions, they were survival decisions. That incentive hasn't changed, regardless of who's in office. When the system is threatened, leaders will always choose preservation over individual wealth protection. They'll choose inflation over default. They'll choose control over freedom. Not because they're evil, but because the alternative is immediate collapse, and collapse is politically unacceptable. So why are warnings becoming more visible now? Because constraint is becoming harder to hide. Debt limits flexibility. Inflation limits policy space. Geopolitics complicates coordination. And when options narrow, messaging shifts. Trump's warning isn't about fear. It's about preparing people for a world where trade-offs are unavoidable, where easy solutions don't exist, where every choice comes with a cost that someone has to pay. And usually, that someone is the person holding cash, saving in dollars, trusting that tomorrow will look like yesterday. Because currency debasement is the quietest tax. It doesn't require legislation. It doesn't require votes. It just happens, slowly, until your purchasing power is half what it was, and you're not sure exactly when it disappeared. For everyday people, the implication is simple but uncomfortable. Cash doesn't disappear in a crisis. It quietly loses influence. Inflation doesn't announce itself dramatically. It reduces choices over time. Your grocery bill gets higher. Your rent increases. Your savings buy less. And you're told it's temporary, it's transitory, it's due to supply chains or corporate greed or anything except the actual cause, which is too much money chasing the same amount of goods. This is why diversification conversations are returning. Not because collapse is certain, but because concentration risk is rising. Holding everything in one currency, in one system, in one assumption about the future, that's a bet. And right now, that bet is riskier than it's been in decades. The most dangerous moment in any system isn't the crash, it's the transition. When confidence still exists, but cracks are forming. When people assume tomorrow will look like yesterday. That's when most people are unprepared. That's when the smart money moves quietly, repositioning, before the crowd realizes what's happening. Because once everyone sees it, once the risk becomes consensus, it's too late to act without paying a premium. The best opportunities to protect wealth exist in the window between signal and certainty. And we're in that window right now. Trump's warning is part of that signal. It's not isolated. It's part of a broader pattern of institutions, leaders, and sophisticated players adjusting their positioning, their messaging, their expectations. They're not panicking, they're preparing. And preparation implies an understanding that current conditions are not sustainable, that something has to give, whether that's inflation, defaults, currency adjustments, or some combination we haven't fully anticipated yet. The direction is clear even if the timing isn't. So here's the question you should be asking yourself, honestly. If volatility increases, if policy options narrow, if global dynamics continue shifting, are you positioned only for the best case or also for resilience? Because hoping nothing changes is not the same as preparing for change. And the difference between those two approaches could determine whether you preserve your wealth or watch it erode in real time while being told everything is fine. This isn't about panic. It's not about selling everything and hiding in a bunker. It's about recognizing that the playbook that worked for the last 40 years, save in dollars, trust the Fed, assume infinite liquidity, that playbook might not work in the next phase. The rules are changing. Not because of ideology, but because of math. Because debt compounds. Because trust erodes. Because systems built on assumptions eventually meet reality. And when they do, the people who prepared early don't get rich. They just don't get destroyed. And sometimes, not getting destroyed is the smartest financial decision you can make. What's particularly telling about this moment is how quietly the transition is happening. There's no single dramatic event, no black swan moment that everyone can point to and say, that's when everything changed. Instead, it's a series of small adjustments, incremental shifts, barely noticeable deteriorations that only make sense when you step back and look at the pattern. The yield curve inverts, then normalizes. Regional banks fail, then get absorbed. Inflation spikes, then moderates, but never quite returns to where it was. Each event gets explained away in isolation, treated as temporary or manageable. But taken together, they paint a picture of a system under stress, adapting, bending, searching for equilibrium in an environment that's fundamentally different from what came before. And here's what makes preparation so difficult for most people. The system doesn't fail all at once. It fails in stages. First slowly, almost imperceptibly, then faster, then all at once. We're in the slow phase right now, where things still mostly work, where denial is still comfortable, where the cost of preparing feels higher than the risk of not preparing. But slow phases don't last forever. They accelerate. And the acceleration often happens faster than people expect, driven by feedback loops and confidence spirals that are impossible to predict precisely, but very possible to anticipate generally. This is why positioning matters now, while you still have options, while markets are still liquid, while you can make choices without forced selling or panic decisions. The reality is, we're living through a monetary regime change, whether it happens over 2 years or 10. The post-Bretton Woods dollar system, the one that's existed since 1971, is reaching its natural limits, not because of conspiracy or malice, but because of mathematics and incentives. When you can print the world's reserve currency, you will. When you can borrow at artificially low rates, you will. When you can export inflation to trading partners, you will. Until you can't, and we're approaching the can't. The global willingness to absorb unlimited dollar creation is waning. The ability to suppress interest rates indefinitely has ended. The assumption that central banks can always save markets is being tested. These aren't problems that get solved with one election or one policy change. They're structural. And structural problems require structural adjustments, the kind that reshape how wealth is stored, how trade is conducted, how power is measured. Trump's red flag isn't a prediction. It's a signal. And signals matter most before everyone agrees they matter. The economy may be closer to breaking than any headline will admit, not because of politics, not because of one person or one policy, but because of structural forces that have been building for years, hidden beneath the surface, papered over with liquidity and optimism. And now, as those forces become harder to ignore, the narrative is shifting from confidence to caution, from promises to warnings, from certainty to preparation. If you want to understand money, power, and risk before narratives shift, subscribe to the Wealth Continuum. Because by the time the story is obvious, the opportunity to prepare is usually gone. Drop a comment, tell me what you think is coming, tell me if you're seeing these same patterns where you are, because this conversation matters. And the people having it early are the ones who won't be caught off guard when the transition accelerates. I'll see you in the next one.